Sarah Chen had learned to measure her life in the space between paychecks. Each dollar that arrived was already spoken for before it touched her account, allocated to rent that climbed faster than her wages, to groceries stretched thin across too many days, to the electric bill that threatened disconnection with increasing frequency. She no longer remembered what it felt like to buy something without first calculating what would have to be sacrificed in return. The apartment she shared with her daughter Maya was not the worst place they had lived, but it existed in that gray zone between temporary and permanent, a space she occupied while pretending it was a choice rather than a circumstance. The walls were thin enough that arguments from neighboring units became part of their daily soundtrack. The plumbing complained loudly at inconvenient hours. The parking lot flooded when it rained, turning the walk to her car into an obstacle course of murky puddles that soaked through shoes she could not afford to replace. Maya was 7 now, old enough to notice when dinner consisted of rice and canned vegetables for the 3rd night in a row, old enough to stop asking for things she knew they could not have. That awareness in her daughter's eyes hurt more than any overdue notice ever could. Sarah had tried to shield her from the mathematics of poverty, but children absorbed these lessons through observation rather than explanation. They learned to make themselves smaller, to want less, to apologize for needing anything at all. The job Sarah held was the kind that demanded everything while promising nothing. She worked as a dispatcher for a small logistics company, spending her days coordinating routes and schedules for drivers who earned more than she did. The office was a converted warehouse space where fluorescent lights buzzed constantly and the air conditioning worked only when the owner remembered to have it serviced. Her supervisor was a man who measured productivity in keystrokes and bathroom breaks, who spoke to her as though her time had no value beyond what he purchased from it. She had applied to better positions, sent resumes into the void of online portals, where hope went to die quietly. The responses, when they came at all, were polite rejections that thanked her for her interest while making it clear that interest was not enough. Experience required experience. Advancement required connections she did not possess. The ladder everyone spoke of climbing seemed designed for people who started several rungs higher than she ever had. Her parents were gone, lost to separate illnesses that had arrived too close together, leaving her with hospital bills that still echoed years later. Her ex-husband had vanished into a life that did not include child support, his last known address disconnected, his promises as empty as the bank account they had once shared. She had learned not to expect rescue from any direction. Survival was a solitary endeavor, and she had become efficient at it in ways that felt more like erosion than achievement. The breaking point arrived on a Wednesday afternoon in October. Maya's school had called to inform her that lunch account funds had been depleted. The notification was delivered with professional sympathy, but Sarah heard the judgment beneath it. Parents who could not manage something as basic as school lunch were filed into a category she had spent years trying to avoid. She transferred the last $18 from her checking account during her lunch break, sitting in her car with her hands shaking, knowing that the gas tank was nearly empty and payday was still 4 days away. That evening, while Maya practiced spelling words at the kitchen table, Sarah opened her laptop and began searching. Not for jobs this time, but for opportunities that existed outside the systems that had consistently rejected her. Real estate forums, auction sites, foreclosure listings, anything that promised access to property for people who had been priced out of conventional ownership. The idea had been forming slowly over months, a desperate calculus that maybe, somehow, owning something outright could break the cycle of rent that consumed half her income without building any equity. Most of what she found was either too expensive or too damaged to be functional. properties advertised as fixer-uppers that required capital she would never accumulate, land sold in parcels, too remote to be useful, commercial spaces with price tags that made her laugh bitterly at her own audacity for looking. She was about to close the laptop when a listing appeared that stopped her. The property was described in language that worked hard to obscure its condition. Former furniture manufacturing facility. The heading read, "Opportunity for creative redevelopment." The photographs showed a sprawling brick structure with boarded windows and weeds, reclaiming the parking lot. The roof sagged in places. Graffiti decorated walls that had once borne the company name in proud letters, now faded to ghosts. The listing noted that the building had been abandoned for over a decade, that multiple previous owners had defaulted on renovation plans, that the city was motivated to see it occupied or demolished. The price was listed at $950. Sarah read the number 3 times, certain she had misunderstood. It was not a typo. The listing explained that the property was being sold as is for the price of unpaid back taxes, that the buyer would assume responsibility for bringing the structure up to code or removing it entirely, that financing was not available and payment would need to be made in full at closing. The amount was absurd, impossibly low, the kind of number that appeared only when something was fundamentally broken beyond repair. She clicked through the photographs again, studying each image for clues about why the property had been abandoned. The interior shots revealed vast open spaces filled with debris. Old machinery rusted in place, forgotten tools scattered across concrete floors, coated in years of dust and pigeon droppings. Water damage had stained the walls in patterns that suggested a roof that leaked freely. Broken glass littered areas where windows had shattered and never been replaced. It looked like a building waiting for permission to collapse. Yet beneath the decay, Sarah could see the bones of something substantial. The brick walls were thick, the kind built to last generations rather than decades. The ceiling height suggested spaces designed for industrial work, rooms large enough to be divided and repurposed. The location, buried in the listing's final paragraph, placed the property on the outskirts of the warehouse district, an area that had been slowly gentrifying as artists and small businesses sought affordable space. Comparable buildings, the ones that had been renovated, now leased for amounts that made Sarah's current rent look modest. She allowed herself a moment to imagine. The building could be cleaned, secured, perhaps divided into sections. One area could become a small apartment, basic but livable, eliminating the rent that bled her dry each month. The rest could be storage, workshop space, something she could lease to others and generate income. It was a fantasy built on optimism she could not afford, but the price tag made it almost accessible. $950 was still more than she had, but it was within the realm of the imaginable rather than the impossible. Sleep did not come easily that night. She lay in bed, listening to Maya's quiet breathing from the next room, calculating and recalculating what it would take to make this work. Her savings account, carefully rebuilt after the last emergency, held $423. Her next paycheck would add another $600 after taxes. She could sell the few items of value she still possessed, the laptop itself if necessary, her grandmother's ring that she had sworn never to part with. It would be close, painfully close, and it would leave her with nothing in reserve. The risk was enormous. If the building proved unusable, if the structural damage was worse than the photographs suggested, if the city condemned it before she could make improvements, she would lose everything. $950 was not much to someone with cushion in their life, but for her, it represented months of sacrifice. Every dollar extracted from a budget that had no room for extraction. Losing it would not simply be a setback. It would be devastating. Yet the alternative was to continue exactly as she had been, working without rest, paying rent that built nothing, watching Maya grow up in apartments that would never be home. The trajectory was clear. She could maintain this indefinitely, treading water until something broke, or she could take a risk that might drown her faster, but offered the only chance of reaching solid ground. By morning, she had made her decision. It was not based on confidence or careful analysis. It was based on the understanding that staying still was its own form of failure, and that, if she was going to fail, it might as well be while attempting something different. She called the number on the listing during her lunch break, speaking to a clerk at the county tax office who sounded surprised that anyone was interested. The process, she was told, was straightforward. Submit payment, sign the transfer documents, assume all liability. No inspections were required because the property was being sold for demolition value. The clerk asked if she had visited the site. Sarah admitted she had not. There was a pause on the line, long enough for her to feel the weight of judgment being applied. The clerk suggested, in a tone that was almost kind, that she might want to see what she was buying before committing funds. Sarah thanked her and ended the call, knowing that seeing it in person would only confirm what the photographs already showed. If she went there, if she stood in front of that ruined building and felt the full weight of its decay, she would lose her nerve. Telling her family was harder than making the decision itself. Sarah's sister Jennifer lived 2 states away, married to a man whose income allowed her luxuries like spontaneity and vacation photographs that filled social media with evidence of a life gone right. When Sarah called to explain what she was planning, the silence on the other end lasted long enough to measure disappointment. Jennifer did not shout. She simply asked a series of questions that Sarah could not answer satisfactorily. What would she do about Maya's school? How would she manage repairs without money? What if the building was condemned? Each question was fair, reasonable, rooted in the practical concerns of someone who had never had to choose between bad options and worse ones. Sarah tried to explain the logic, the calculation that owning something broken might be better than owning nothing at all, but the words sounded hollow even to her own ears. The conversation ended with Jennifer offering to lend her $200, not to buy the building, but to keep her from buying it. The offer was presented as help, but Sarah heard it as doubt, as confirmation that even the people who loved her believed she was making a mistake. She declined as gently as she could, knowing that accepting money meant accepting the judgment that came with it. Her co-workers were less diplomatic. When she mentioned during a break that she was considering a real estate purchase, the room had gone quiet with a curiosity that felt predatory. Someone asked, "What kind of property?" When she described the furniture factory, the responses ranged from laughter to outright concern. One woman, whose own house had appreciated steadily for a decade, asked if Sarah understood the liability she would be assuming. Another suggested, with a smile that did not quite hide condescension, that maybe she should focus on saving for a reliable car first. The worst comment came from her supervisor, who had overheard enough to insert himself into the conversation. He told her, in a voice loud enough to carry across the office, that buying a condemned building was what desperate people did when they did not understand how money actually worked. He said it as though he were offering wisdom, as though his own path from middle management to middle management qualified him to judge hers. Sarah felt her face flush with anger and humiliation, but she nodded and returned to her desk without argument, knowing that defending herself would only confirm what they already believed. That night, she sat Maya down at the kitchen table and tried to explain what was about to happen in terms a 7-year-old could understand. She spoke of a building that needed help, of a chance to live somewhere they owned rather than rented, of an adventure that would be difficult but might lead to something better. Maya listened with the seriousness she brought to everything lately, her dark eyes searching her mother's face for reassurance. Sarah was not certain she could provide. When Maya asked if they would still have their apartment, Sarah hesitated. The truth was that keeping the apartment would require money they would not have once the building was purchased. The plan, as much as it existed, was to move into the factory as quickly as possible, to make one section livable enough to serve as temporary shelter while they worked on the rest. It was not ideal. It was barely functional. But it was the only way the numbers worked. She told Maya that they would be moving to a new place, that it would be different from where they lived now, that it might be uncomfortable at first, but would get better. She did not tell her daughter that they would be living in a structure without working plumbing or heat, that they would be sleeping in a building the city considered derelict, that everything depended on her ability to transform something broken into something livable, with skills she did not possess and resources she did not have. Maya asked if she could bring her stuffed animals. Sarah said yes. Feeling the sting of tears, she refused to let fall. If her daughter's greatest concern was the safety of her toys, then Sarah had at least managed to shield her from the full gravity of what they were about to attempt. The week before the closing felt like the longest of her life. She sold what she could, posting items online for whatever price someone would pay. The laptop went first, followed by the television, the microwave, a shelf of books she had collected when she still believed reading for pleasure was a thing people like her were allowed to do. Each transaction felt like shedding parts of herself, reducing her life to the elements deemed essential for survival. She kept Maya's things untouched, unwilling to ask her daughter to sacrifice more than she already had. The money accumulated slowly, painfully. $400 from the laptop, $60 from the television, $20 here, $15 there. Each amount so small it felt like mockery. She picked up extra shifts at work, volunteering for weekends and late nights that left her exhausted enough to sleep without dreaming. Her supervisor commented that it was good to see her taking initiative, as though desperation and ambition were indistinguishable from a distance. On the morning of the closing, Sarah counted the cash she had assembled. $962, just barely enough to cover the purchase price and the minimal fees associated with the transfer. She had $12 left in her checking account and a quarter tank of gas. It was the closest she had ever come to true financial zero, the point where a single unexpected expense would push her into a collapse from which there might be no recovery. The tax office where the closing took place was a municipal building that smelled of old paperwork and institutional cleaning products. The clerk who processed the transaction was the same woman Sarah had spoken to on the phone, her expression neutral, but her tone carrying the faint suggestion that this was a mistake being made in real time. She asked Sarah to confirm that she understood the property was being sold as is, that no warranties were provided, that the structure might not be salvageable. Sarah confirmed everything, signing documents with a hand that wanted to tremble but refused to show weakness. When it was finished, when the deed had been transferred and the payment recorded, the clerk handed her a single key attached to a faded tag. The building was hers now, for better or worse. She had gambled everything on a structure she had never seen in person, on a hope that was more calculation than confidence. As she walked out of the office and into the pale afternoon light, Sarah felt the weight of what she had done settle around her like a physical thing. There was no going back now. The apartment lease would expire at the end of the month. The money was gone. Her life, and Maya's, now depended entirely on whether a ruined factory could be transformed into something that resembled a home. She drove to the property directly from the tax office, unable to delay any longer. The address led her through streets that grew progressively more industrial, past warehouses and distribution centers, auto repair shops with chain-link fences, and businesses that looked as though they operated on the margins of legitimacy. The neighborhood was not dangerous exactly, but it carried an atmosphere of abandonment, of buildings and people waiting for something better that had not yet arrived. The factory stood at the end of a narrow access road, separated from the main street by a stretch of cracked asphalt and weeds that had grown tall enough to obscure the property line. The first thing Sarah noticed was the size. The photographs had not conveyed the scale of the structure, the way it dominated the empty lot, like a monument to an industrial era that had moved on without looking back. The brick facade rose 3 stories, its windows boarded or broken, its walls stained by water and weather into patterns that looked almost deliberate. She parked in what had once been a parking lot, now reduced to broken concrete and scattered debris. The silence was immediate and total. No traffic sounds reached this far from the main road. No voices carried from neighboring properties. It felt like the edge of the world, a place where the city ended and something undefined began. She sat in the car for a long time, staring at the building she had just purchased, trying to reconcile the reality before her with the hope she had been nurturing. The structure was worse than the photograph suggested. Everywhere she looked, she saw evidence of decay that had progressed beyond superficial damage into structural compromise. The roof sagged visibly in multiple places. The gutters hung loose, filled with years of accumulated leaves and debris. The loading dock at the rear of the building had partially collapsed, its concrete platform cracked and tilted at an angle that suggested the ground beneath had shifted. Graffiti covered every accessible surface, bright tags layered over older marks until the walls became a palimpsest of trespassing and territorial claims. Sarah forced herself out of the car, feeling the October wind cut through her jacket with a coldness that seemed personal. The key in her hand felt heavier than any object she had ever held. She approached the main entrance, a steel door set into a recessed alcove where broken glass crunched beneath her shoes. The lock resisted at first, rusted from years of neglect, but it turned eventually with a grinding sound that echoed in the empty space around her. The door opened inward, revealing darkness so complete it seemed to have weight. The smell that emerged was overwhelming, a mixture of mold, rust, animal droppings, and decay that made her gag. She fumbled for her phone, using its flashlight to pierce the gloom, and stepped inside with a caution that felt like cowardice but was actually self-preservation. The interior was vast, a single open space that stretched the length of the building. Columns of brick and steel supported a ceiling so high it disappeared into shadow. The floor was concrete, cracked and stained, covered in debris that had accumulated over years of abandonment. Old machinery sat in rusted rows, their purposes unclear, their surfaces coated in dust so thick it looked like fur. Broken pallets were stacked haphazardly against walls. Shattered glass formed constellations across the floor where skylights had failed. Birds had nested in the rafters, their droppings forming thick layers below that had begun to calcify into something that resembled stone. Sarah walked forward slowly, her phone light cutting narrow paths through the darkness. Every step produced sounds: the crunch of glass, the scrape of debris, the hollow echo of her boots against concrete. The building felt less like a structure than a living thing, wounded and resentful, aware of her presence in ways she could not name. She reached the center of the space and turned in a slow circle, trying to imagine how this could ever become livable, how she could transform this ruin into shelter. The enormity of the task crashed into her with a force that made her knees weak. This was not a project. It was an impossibility. She had bought a building that existed only to be demolished, a problem too expensive for anyone else to solve, and she had done it with money she could not afford to lose. The realization made her want to sit down on the filthy floor and weep, But she remained standing, refusing to grant the building that satisfaction. She forced herself to explore, moving through the space with methodical determination, even as her heart sank with each new discovery. The second floor was accessible via a steel staircase that had rusted until it barely supported her weight. The rooms here were smaller, offices perhaps, or storage areas. The walls were water damaged to the point of collapse in places. The ceilings sagged ominously. One room had no floor at all, the boards having rotted through to reveal the space below. Another was filled with old furniture, desks and chairs stacked in a chaos that suggested they had been thrown rather than placed. The third floor was worse, if such a thing were possible. The roof had failed completely in sections, allowing weather to pour in unimpeded. Plant life had begun to reclaim the interior, saplings growing from cracks in the floor, vines creeping across walls. The smell here was different, more organic, the scent of decomposition and growth happening simultaneously. She did not stay long, the structural integrity too questionable to justify exploration. When she returned to the ground floor, daylight was beginning to fade. The building's interior grew darker as evening approached, the shadows deepening until they seemed to move independently of the light. Sarah stood near the entrance, looking back into the space she now owned, and felt a despair so complete it bordered on acceptance. She had made a catastrophic mistake. She had gambled everything and lost before the game even began. Yet beneath the despair, something else stirred. Anger, perhaps, or stubbornness. She had survived worse than this. She had raised a daughter alone while working jobs that treated her as disposable. She had rebuilt her life from nothing multiple times, each reconstruction a little less complete than the last, but still functional. This building was just another impossible problem, another obstacle that the world had placed in her path, assuming she would surrender. She had 962 fewer reasons to surrender than she'd had that morning, and nowhere else to go even if she wanted to. She left the factory as darkness settled fully, locking the door behind her with a finality that felt like commitment. The drive back to the apartment was long, giving her time to begin constructing the plan she would need to survive what came next. She would have to move quickly, before the lease ended and before winter made the building uninhabitable. She would need to identify one section of the ground floor that could be sealed off, heated somehow, made barely livable. Everything else could wait. Survival first, improvement later, maybe never. But that was a problem for a future version of herself, one who had the luxury of planning beyond tomorrow. When she arrived home, Maya was asleep on the couch, where the neighbor who had been watching her had left her. Sarah paid the neighbor the last of her cash, $5 that felt like 500, and carried her daughter to bed with a gentleness that bordered on reverence. Maya stirred but did not wake, her trust in her mother's ability to protect her still intact, despite everything. Sarah stood in the doorway of the small bedroom, watching her daughter sleep, and made a silent promise. Whatever it took, however impossible it seemed, she would make the factory work. She would give Maya a home that was theirs, a place where rent could not evict them, where they answered to no one but themselves. The building might be a ruin, but ruins could be rebuilt. They had to be, because the alternative was unthinkable, and Sarah Chen had run out of alternatives the moment she signed that deed. The final weeks in the apartment passed in a blur of activity that felt both frantic and futile. Sarah worked her regular shifts, while spending every spare moment planning for a move that everyone around her seemed to regard as a slow-motion disaster. She researched building codes, watched YouTube videos about basic construction and electrical work, joined online forums, where people discussed renovations with casual expertise that made her feel hopelessly outmatched. Every tutorial revealed 10 new problems she had not anticipated. Every forum post described costs that made her stomach clench with anxiety. She made lists that grew longer each day, cataloging everything that needed to be addressed before the factory could become minimally habitable. Water, heat, electricity, sanitation, security. Each item represented challenges that required either money she did not have or skills she had not acquired. The internet was filled with cheerful DIY content that assumed access to tools, time, and a baseline of competence she could not claim. She watched videos of people transforming abandoned buildings into trendy lofts, their projects bankrolled by savings or sponsors, their confidence rooted in safety nets she had never possessed. Her sister called twice more during those weeks, each conversation a variation on the same theme, of concern masquerading as support. Jennifer offered again to help, but only if Sarah would reconsider the move, abandon the factory, use whatever money she had left to find a proper apartment in a better neighborhood. The offers were genuine, but they came with conditions that Sarah could not accept without admitting complete defeat. She declined each time, her voice steady even as her resolve wavered, knowing that accepting rescue meant surrendering the last piece of autonomy she had been fighting to preserve. Work became increasingly difficult to navigate. Her supervisor had noticed her distraction, the way her attention drifted during meetings, the mistakes that crept into her route assignments when exhaustion overwhelmed focus. He called her into his office one afternoon and suggested, with a sympathy that felt insulting, that she might want to consider whether this job was still the right fit for her. The implication was clear: improve or leave. She assured him she was committed, that the errors were temporary, that everything would normalize soon. He accepted her assurance with a skepticism that told her she was already being mentally replaced. The day the lease expired arrived with the same indifference with which all deadlines arrived, announcing itself only through the calendar's quiet insistence that time did not pause for difficulty. Sarah had spent the previous evening packing their few remaining possessions into boxes and bags that filled her car to capacity. Furniture was left behind, too bulky to move and too worthless to justify the effort. The landlord had already informed her that the deposit would not be returned, citing damage she did not remember causing, charges for cleaning she knew were inflated. She did not argue. She no longer had the energy to fight battles that would not change the outcome. Maya asked questions that morning that Sarah answered with approximations of truth. Where would they sleep tonight? In the new building. Would there be a bed? Soon. Would it be warm? She was working on it. Each answer felt like a small betrayal, a promise made by someone who had no guarantee of keeping it. Maya accepted everything with the quiet resilience she had developed, and that acceptance hurt worse than any complaint could have. They drove to the factory in early afternoon, the car loaded so heavily that it sat low on worn suspension. Sarah had tried to time their arrival for daylight, needing to see clearly what they were entering, wanting to preserve the illusion of control for as long as possible. The neighborhood looked different in the harsh light of day, more desolate somehow. The empty buildings and industrial decay impossible to romanticize. She pulled into the broken parking lot and sat for a moment, hands on the steering wheel, gathering whatever remained of her strength. Maya was silent beside her, staring at the factory with an expression Sarah could not read. Fear, perhaps, or curiosity, or the kind of blank acceptance that came from trusting adults to make sense of chaos. Sarah wanted to say something reassuring, to explain how this would all work out, but the words would have been lies, and Maya deserved better than that. Instead, she reached over and squeezed her daughter's hand, a gesture that communicated what language could not. They unloaded the car methodically, carrying boxes and bags through the steel door and into the cavernous space that smelled no better than it had on her first visit. Sarah had designated a corner of the ground floor as their temporary living area, the section that seemed most structurally sound and farthest from the obvious water damage. She had brought a camping stove, sleeping bags rated for cold weather, battery-powered lanterns that cast harsh white light into shadows that seemed reluctant to recede. It looked less like a home than a survival camp, and that was exactly what it was. The first night was harder than Sarah had allowed herself to imagine. The building produced sounds that seemed impossible for an empty structure, creaks and groans that echoed through the vast space, scratching noises from walls that suggested the presence of animals she did not want to identify. The temperature dropped as evening became night, the brick walls offering no insulation against October's deepening cold. She and Maya huddled together in sleeping bags, wearing every layer of clothing they owned, breathing air that tasted of rust and mold. Maya cried quietly, the kind of tears that came from trying not to cry, and Sarah held her close, whispering promises she desperately hoped she could keep. They would make it better. They would make it warm. They would make it home. The words felt hollow against the reality of cold concrete and darkness pressing in from all sides, but she repeated them anyway, as much for her own benefit as for Maya's. Sleep came in fragments, interrupted by cold and discomfort, and the persistent feeling that they were trespassing in a space that did not want them there. Sarah woke repeatedly to check on Maya, to adjust blankets, to shine a light into corners where sounds originated. Each time she woke, she felt the full weight of her decision, the understanding that she had brought her daughter to this place, that whatever happened next was her responsibility alone. Morning arrived gray and cold, light filtering through broken skylights in shafts that revealed how much dust filled the air. Sarah's body ached from sleeping on concrete, barely cushioned by the thin camping mat she had thought would be sufficient. Maya was awake, but silent, her eyes tracking the vast space around them, with an alertness that suggested she had not slept much either. They ate breakfast, sitting on boxes, cereal with powdered milk, mixed in water that tasted faintly metallic from the gallon jug Sarah had filled at a gas station the night before. After Maya finished eating, she asked the question Sarah had been dreading. When could she go back to school? Sarah had been avoiding this, knowing that the answer would require explanations she was not ready to give. The school was across town, too far to walk, and their current situation made the logistics of daily transportation nearly impossible. She had been researching online schooling options, free programs that might bridge the gap, but implementation required internet access they did not have and a stability they had not yet achieved. She told Maya they would take a break from school for a little while, just until things settled. She could see the relief in her daughter's eyes, the unspoken understanding that this meant she would not have to explain to classmates where she lived now, would not have to face the questions that came from showing up in the same clothes multiple days in a row. The relief made Sarah's chest tighten. A 7-year-old should not be grateful to miss school because she was ashamed of her circumstances. The next days were consumed by the urgent work of making the space barely functional. Sarah rigged a makeshift curtain to section off their living area from the rest of the factory, using sheets and rope to create the illusion of privacy and containment. She swept obsessively, pushing back the layers of debris and filth that had accumulated, creating a perimeter that felt clean enough to exist in. She made repeated trips to second-hand stores and dollar shops, buying cleaning supplies, plastic sheeting to cover broken windows, duct tape that became her primary tool for temporary repairs. Water was the most pressing problem. The building's plumbing had been shut off years ago, the pipes likely frozen and burst in multiple locations. She located a park 3 blocks away with public restrooms that became their washing station, their drinking fountain, their tenuous connection to basic sanitation. She bought a camping toilet, the kind used for extended outdoor trips, and set it up behind a makeshift privacy screen, trying not to think too much about the indignity of the arrangement. Heat was equally urgent. She found a used propane heater at a pawn shop, bartering the only item of value she had left, the ring that had belonged to her grandmother. The proprietor had looked at it skeptically, tested it with tools she did not understand, and offered her an amount that was probably a fraction of its worth. She accepted without negotiation, knowing that sentiment was a luxury she could not afford. The heater helped, but only within a small radius. The rest of the factory remained bitterly cold, the open space impossible to warm without resources she did not possess. Maya adapted with a resilience that broke Sarah's heart. She made games out of their situation, pretending they were explorers camping in an ancient ruin, creating stories that transformed their desperate circumstances into adventures. Sarah played along, grateful for her daughter's imagination, even as she recognized it as a coping mechanism, a child's way of processing trauma by reframing it into something bearable. At night, when Maya finally slept, Sarah allowed herself to feel the full weight of what she had done, the magnitude of the gamble that was looking more like a catastrophic error with each passing day. The building itself remained a mystery that revealed itself in layers. As Sarah spent more time exploring, trying to understand what she had actually purchased, she discovered details that the initial survey had missed. The factory had been more than just manufacturing space. There were offices on the second floor that, despite water damage, still held filing cabinets full of old paperwork. There was a break room with appliances that had been stripped for parts. There was a loading dock area that opened to a rear lot even more overgrown than the front. And there were doors, numerous doors, some locked, some rusted shut, leading to spaces she had not yet accessed. One door in particular caught her attention. It was located in a back corner of the ground floor, behind a section of collapsed shelving that she had to clear away to fully expose it. Unlike the other doors, which were either wood or hollow metal, this one was solid steel, reinforced with bolts along its frame. The lock was different too, a heavy mechanism that had been designed to resist tampering. She tried the key she had been given at the closing, but it did not fit. This door required something else, something that had not been included in the transfer. The door intrigued her in a way she could not fully explain. It seemed out of place, too secure for a furniture factory, suggesting that whatever lay behind it had once been valuable enough to protect with measures that exceeded normal industrial security. She made a mental note to return to it when more pressing survival needs had been addressed, filing it away as another mystery in a building that seemed constructed from secrets and decay. 3 weeks into their occupancy, Sarah's car broke down. The engine, which had been making concerning noises for months, finally surrendered completely, dying in the parking lot of the grocery store where she had been buying supplies. The mechanic's estimate for repairs exceeded what she had paid for the factory, a number so absurdly high that she laughed when he told her, the kind of laughter that emerged when the only alternative was screaming. She had the car towed back to the factory, where it now sat as another piece of debris, another problem she lacked resources to solve. Without transportation, everything became exponentially harder. The park, with the public restrooms, was walkable, but carrying water back in jugs became a physical ordeal. Shopping required planning, limiting purchases to what she could physically carry. Work became impossible. She had called in sick, then taken unpaid leave, knowing she was likely losing a job she could not afford to lose, but unable to imagine how she could continue performing it while living in the conditions she now occupied. The supervisor's prediction had proven correct. She was no longer a good fit. She was barely functional. Money dwindled to amounts that could be measured in single digits. She spent nothing that was not absolutely essential, eating cheap food that required minimal preparation, limiting Maya's portions while pretending her own lack of appetite was natural rather than strategic. The factory, which had consumed all her resources, now demanded more, its needs infinite, its willingness to yield comfort non-existent. She had bought a problem that would not be solved by effort alone, and the realization pressed on her with suffocating weight. It was during this nadir, when Sarah had begun to seriously consider whether she needed to contact social services, whether Maya would be better off in any situation that did not involve sleeping in a derelict factory, that she returned to the steel door. She had been clearing more debris, working because movement prevented thinking, when she noticed something she had missed before. The collapsed shelving that had concealed the door had not simply fallen randomly. It had been arranged deliberately to hide the entrance, the placement too precise to be accidental. She pulled away more of the debris, working with a focus that bordered on obsession. As she moved pieces aside, she found other signs of intentional concealment. Boxes stacked just so, pallets positioned to direct attention elsewhere. Someone had gone to considerable effort to make this door disappear, to ensure it would not be noticed by casual observers. The realization made her pulse quicken with something that felt dangerous, like hope. Sarah stood before the steel door for a long time, her breath visible in the cold air, studying the lock mechanism with an attention she had not applied to anything in weeks. The door itself was remarkable in its construction, far heavier than any interior door should be, its surface unmarred by the rust that had claimed every other metal fixture in the building. Someone had maintained this, or it had been sealed so completely that time itself could not reach it. She ran her fingers along the frame, feeling where the bolts had been driven deep into the surrounding brick. This was not a door meant to be opened casually. It was a barrier, engineered to keep something in or keep someone out. The lock was a complex mechanism, something she associated with safes or bank vaults, rather than factory storage. She pulled at it experimentally, knowing it would not yield, but needing to confirm the futility of brute force. The question of what lay behind the door consumed her thoughts in the days that followed. She could not afford to hire someone to open it professionally, and even if she could, the cost would be measured against Maya's meals, against the propane that kept them from freezing. Yet, the door represented a mystery that might contain answers to questions she had not yet formulated. Buildings did not install security like this without reason. Furniture factories did not need vault doors. She began researching the building's history, spending hours at the public library where free internet access allowed her to dig through digital archives and property records. The factory had been built in 1947, constructed by a family-owned furniture company that had operated continuously until the early 1992s. The business had been successful by local standards, employing over 100 workers at its peak, producing mid-range furniture that was sold regionally. Newspaper articles from that era showed a thriving operation. Photographs of workers standing proudly beside finished pieces, owners cutting ribbons at expansion ceremonies. The decline had been gradual but terminal. Competition from overseas manufacturers had eroded profit margins. A fire in 1989 had damaged part of the facility, and while insurance covered repairs, the interruption had cost them contracts that never returned. By 1993, the company had filed for bankruptcy. The property changed hands multiple times over the next 2 decades, each new owner arriving with plans for redevelopment that dissolved when the reality of costs became clear. The most recent foreclosure had come in 2011, after which the building had sat vacant, accumulating tax liens that eventually led to the auction where Sarah had acquired it. What struck her most in this research was a gap. During the bankruptcy proceedings, the inventory list had been unusually sparse. For a factory that had supposedly been in full operation until the end, the materials and finished goods catalogued seemed insufficient. Equipment was listed and accounted for, but the raw materials, the specialty woods, the hardware, the items that would have represented significant capital investment, were noted as disposed of prior to closing, without further detail. It was a small inconsistency, easily overlooked, but it caught her attention in a way that larger irregularities might not have. She found references to the original owner, Marcus Brennan, a man who had built the company from nothing and run it until his death in 1991. His obituary was brief, noting his business success, his community involvement, and the donation of his personal papers to the local historical society. Sarah made a note to visit the historical society when time permitted, though she was not certain what she expected to find. Dead men did not explain locked doors in buildings they no longer owned. Meanwhile, the practical demands of survival continued without pause. Winter was approaching in earnest, and the factory's vast open spaces made heating impossible beyond their small cordoned section. Sarah had begun sealing off additional areas, using plastic sheeting and duct tape to create barriers that trapped what little warmth the propane heater produced. The work was endless and futile, each improvement revealing 3 new problems that required resources she did not have. Maya's situation weighed on her constantly. The child had become quieter, more withdrawn, spending hours drawing pictures of houses that looked nothing like the factory, creating worlds on paper where walls were straight and windows had glass and rooms had doors that closed properly. Sarah recognized the drawings for what they were: escape mechanisms, fantasies of normalcy that her daughter could control even if reality remained beyond her reach. She tried to engage Maya in conversations, in activities, but exhaustion limited her capacity for enthusiasm. They were surviving, but not living, and the distinction grew more pronounced each day. The weather turned colder in mid-November, bringing rain that found every weakness in the factory's compromised roof. Water poured through gaps in multiple locations, creating puddles that merged into shallow lakes across the concrete floor. Sarah spent an entire day moving their possessions to higher ground, stacking boxes on pallets, rigging tarps to redirect water away from their sleeping area. The sound of dripping became constant, a rhythm that invaded her thoughts even when she was not in the building. It was during one of these rainstorms, while Sarah was attempting to patch a particularly aggressive leak, that she noticed something about the steel door. Water was pooling near its base, but unlike other areas where moisture spread freely, here it seemed to disappear. She knelt and examined the gap between the door and the floor, holding her flashlight at an angle to see better. There was space there, more than a typical door clearance, and the water was draining through it, flowing into whatever lay beyond. The observation suggested ventilation, airflow, systems that did not belong in a sealed storage room. She placed her hand near the gap and felt it, a faint current of air moving outward, slightly warmer than the surrounding factory atmosphere. Something behind the door was generating heat, or had been designed to maintain temperature. The implications made her pulse quicken. This was not a closet or storage space. It was an environment, a controlled space that had once required active maintenance. She returned to the library the next day, leaving Maya with a blanket and instructions not to leave their cordoned area. The research took hours, combing through building permits and inspection records, searching for any documentation of modifications to the factory structure. Most of what she found was routine: permits for roof repairs, for electrical work, for the installation of loading equipment. But buried in records from 1987, she found something unusual. A permit for interior structural reinforcement and climate control installation, with a notation that the work would be conducted by a private contractor, details confidential per owner request. The permit had been approved, but there was no inspection record, no certificate of completion. It existed in documentation as a started process that had never been officially finished or had been finished off the books. Sarah photographed the permit with her phone, noting the date, the vague description, the absence of follow-up. It was not proof of anything specific, but it confirmed that the door was not original to the building, that someone had invested in creating a sealed space during the factory's final years of operation. She tried calling the contractor listed on the permit, but the company had dissolved decades ago. She searched for the inspector who had approved the work, but he had retired, and his contact information was not publicly available. Every avenue she pursued ended in dead ends or information that had been deliberately obscured. Someone had gone to considerable effort to ensure that the space behind the door remained unknown, unrecorded, and forgotten. The realization that she was searching for something that had been methodically hidden changed her approach. She stopped looking for official records and began paying attention to absence, to the gaps in documentation, to the careful edits in transaction histories. The factory's sale in 1993 had included an equipment inventory that was suspiciously brief. The subsequent transfers of ownership had all been arm's-length transactions, purchased by entities that left no personal information, bought and sold through lawyers who represented unnamed clients. The building had been passed like a secret, each owner receiving it without the context that would have made the steel door significant. Sarah became obsessed with accessing the space behind the door. She tried prying at the frame with tools scavenged from the debris, but the construction was too solid, engineered to resist exactly this kind of intrusion. She considered breaking through the wall beside the door, but the brick was thick and her tools inadequate. She looked for alternative entrances, crawl spaces, or ventilation shafts that might provide access, but found nothing. The space had been designed with a single point of entry, and that entry required a key she did not possess. Frustration drove her to desperate measures. She attempted to pick the lock, watching YouTube tutorials on her phone battery, which was now their most precious resource, using makeshift tools that bent and broke against the mechanism's complexity. She tried drilling into the lock cylinder, but her cheap drill bit snapped on the hardened steel. She even considered fire, the idea of heating the metal until it weakened, but dismissed the thought as quickly as it formed. She could not risk burning down the only shelter they had, regardless of what mysteries it held. It was Maya who provided the solution, though she did not know she was doing so. The child had been exploring more freely, growing bored with the confined space Sarah had designated as safe. One afternoon, she returned to their area carrying a coffee can filled with items she had found scattered throughout the factory. Old coins, buttons, pieces of broken jewelry, the detritus of decades of occupation. She presented it to Sarah with the pride of a collector, each item a treasure in her 7-year-old estimation. Sarah sorted through the collection absently, her mind elsewhere, until her fingers closed around something that did not belong with the rest. It was a key, larger than normal house keys, its bow marked with a number stamped into the metal. The key was old, but well preserved, its teeth complex, designed for a sophisticated lock. She held it up to the light, feeling her heart accelerate. Maya could not remember where exactly she had found it, gesturing vaguely toward the second floor, somewhere near the offices. Sarah asked her to show her, and they climbed the unstable staircase together, Maya leading her to a corner where broken furniture had been piled. They searched the area methodically, Sarah moving pieces aside, while Maya directed, trying to reconstruct the child's earlier exploration. Eventually, Sarah found what she had been looking for. A desk drawer, fallen behind a filing cabinet, its bottom false, hiding a space where the key had been concealed, along with a small envelope, yellow with age. Her hands shook as she retrieved the envelope, careful not to tear paper that had become brittle over decades. Inside was a note, handwritten in precise script that had faded but remained legible. The note was brief, addressed to no one specifically. The vault contains what could not be disclosed. Authorization codes are no longer relevant. May whoever finds this have better fortune than I did. M.B. The initials meant nothing to Maya, but Sarah recognized them. Marcus Brennan, the original owner, the man who had built the factory and taken its secrets to his grave. This was his handwriting, his final message about something he had hidden deliberately. The vault, not a storage room, a vault. Sarah and Maya returned to the steel door as evening fell, the factory's interior growing dark in the way it did when natural light withdrew and shadows claimed territory. Sarah held the key, feeling its weight, understanding that what came next could not be undone. If the vault was empty, if decades had seen it compromised or emptied by someone else, then this entire obsession had been a waste of energy she could not afford to lose. But if the note meant what it suggested, if Marcus Brennan had hidden something of value, then everything might change. She inserted the key into the lock, half expecting it not to fit, preparing herself for disappointment. The key slid in smoothly, its teeth aligning perfectly with the mechanism's interior. She turned it slowly, feeling tumblers engage, resistance giving way to mechanical precision. There was a deep, satisfying click, the sound of a lock opening after decades of remaining closed. The door's seal released with a subtle hiss, air pressure equalizing, and Sarah felt a breeze from within that carried a scent completely different from the factory's prevailing must and decay. It smelled of wood, oil, and paper, of preserved rather than abandoned space. She pulled the door open, its weight requiring both hands, hinges moving smoothly despite years without use. Beyond the threshold, darkness waited, but it was a different quality of darkness than what filled the rest of the factory. This was contained darkness, the kind that existed in sealed spaces where air did not circulate freely. She reached for her flashlight. Maya pressed close against her side, both of them breathing shallowly, anticipation making the moment feel suspended. The flashlight beam cut into the space, revealing what the darkness had been guarding. Sarah's breath caught. The vault was larger than the door suggested, extending back into what must have been a significant portion of the building's footprint. The walls were lined with shelving, and the shelves were filled, not with furniture or manufacturing equipment, but with wooden crates, dozens of them, stacked in organized rows that spoke of careful inventory and long-term storage. She stepped inside, Maya following, and the door swung, partially closed behind them, narrowing the light from the factory. The vault's atmosphere was different, cooler but drier, as though the climate control Brennan had installed decades ago was still functioning somehow, or had functioned long enough to preserve what he had hidden. The crates were marked with numbers and letters that formed a cataloging system Sarah did not immediately understand. She approached the nearest one, setting her flashlight on a shelf to free both hands. The crate was not nailed shut, but secured with latches that opened easily when she pressed them. The lid lifted with a whisper of old wood, revealing contents wrapped in cloth, packed carefully with attention to preservation. Sarah unwrapped the first item slowly, her hands unsteady, and found herself holding a chair. Not an ordinary chair, but something extraordinary. The wood was dark and lustrous, carved with intricate detail that transformed functional furniture into art. The joinery was flawless, each piece fitting together with precision that seemed impossible without modern tools. She recognized the style, arts and crafts movement, possibly early 20th century, possibly original. She set it down carefully and opened another wrapped bundle from the same crate. A small table, matching the chair, its surface inlaid with contrasting woods that formed geometric patterns. Then a cabinet, its doors revealing compartments lined with green felt. Each piece was pristine, protected from time by the cloth and the vault's controlled environment. This was not mass-produced factory furniture. This was craftsmanship from an era when furniture was built to last generations, when makers signed their work with pride. Sarah moved to another crate, then another, her movements becoming quicker, more frantic, as the scope of what lay before her became clear. The vault was filled with furniture, but not just any furniture. She found pieces marked with makers' stamps she recognized from her research, names that commanded respect in antique circles. Stickley, Roycroft, Limbert, furniture that museums displayed, that collectors pursued, that sold for amounts she had only seen in auction catalogs while killing time in library waiting rooms. One crate contained chairs that still bore original labels, indicating they had never been sold, had been kept as inventory or samples. Another held tables with surfaces so perfectly preserved they looked as though they had been finished yesterday. There were cabinets with original hardware, bookcases with glass doors intact, desks whose drawers still moved smoothly on their slides. Every piece was wrapped, catalogued, protected, as though someone had known that time would need to be held at bay. But the furniture was not all. Sarah found crates that did not contain furniture at all, but documents. Leather portfolios filled with certificates, authentication papers, provenance records that traced ownership histories back decades. She found correspondence between Marcus Brennan and collectors, dealers, auction houses, letters discussing purchases, negotiations for pieces that were rare even when the letters were written, receipts documenting transactions that had never been reported as business income, suggesting this collection had been assembled personally, privately, separate from the factory's legitimate operations. She found photographs, carefully preserved in acid-free sleeves, showing the furniture in various settings: homes of the wealthy, exhibition halls, craftsmen's workshops where the pieces had originally been created. Each photograph was labeled with dates and locations, building a narrative of how Brennan had acquired each item, tracking the collection's growth over decades. This was not a random accumulation. It was a curated collection, assembled with knowledge and passion by someone who understood value in ways that transcended simple commerce. Maya had been exploring too, her small hands touching surfaces with the unconscious confidence of someone who did not yet understand the fragility of valuable things. She called to Sarah, her voice echoing slightly in the vault's contained space, asking what everything was, why the furniture was in boxes, whether they could use it. Sarah tried to explain, her voice unsteady, that these were special pieces, valuable pieces, furniture that was worth money, possibly a lot of money. Maya absorbed this information with the seriousness she brought to adult topics, then asked the question that mattered to her. Could they sell it? Could they use the money to fix the building? The question crystallized something Sarah had been avoiding acknowledging. The collection before her represented wealth, possibly substantial wealth, but in a form that required expertise to realize. She could not simply load a chair into a car she no longer had and drive it to a pawn shop. These pieces needed authentication, appraisal, specialized sales channels that connected collectors with items they sought. She was standing in the middle of fortune that might as well be theoretical until she could find a way to transform it into something fungible. She spent the next hour documenting everything she could with her phone's camera, photographing makers' marks, labels, the arrangement of crates, the condition of pieces. The phone's battery was dying, its charge depleted by the flashlight function and the constant photographing. But she worked urgently, knowing that evidence mattered, that memory was unreliable when stakes were high. She took pictures of documents, of certificates, of correspondence that might establish provenance for pieces whose value depended on authenticated history. When her phone finally died, the vault still held crates she had not opened, sections she had not explored. She felt drunk on discovery, her mind spinning through implications she could barely process. The building she had bought for $950, the ruin that everyone had assured her was worthless, contained a collection that could be worth, what? Tens of thousands? More? She had no framework for estimating, no experience with high-end antiques, no sense of scale for markets she had never imagined entering. They emerged from the vault reluctantly, Sarah pulling the door closed behind them, locking it again, pocketing the key. The factory's open space felt even more desolate now. The contrast between the preserved world behind the steel door and the decay surrounding it, almost surreal. Her mind was already racing ahead, trying to construct a plan from components she did not fully understand. She needed expertise. She needed appraisal. She needed access to markets and buyers who would recognize value rather than seeing only old furniture in need of dusting. That night, Sarah could not sleep, despite exhaustion that had become her baseline state. She lay in the sleeping bag with Maya pressed against her side, staring at the distant ceiling, lost in darkness, and allowed herself to imagine possibilities she had trained herself not to consider. The furniture could be sold. The money could be used, not just to repair the factory, but to transform it, to make it habitable, to give Maya a proper home. They could have heat and running water. Maya could return to school. They could eat meals that were not measured against scarcity. The fantasy was dangerous because it felt attainable, because the vault was real, because fortune was no longer abstract but stacked in wooden crates behind a door she could touch. But alongside the hope, fear coiled equally strong. What if she was wrong? What if the furniture, despite its appearance, was not as valuable as she imagined? What if the market for such pieces had collapsed, leaving her with inventory that could not be sold at any price? What if the act of trying to sell it exposed her to taxes she could not pay, to legal complications she could not navigate, to attention from authorities who would question how someone in her circumstances had acquired such items? The vault had been hidden deliberately. Perhaps there were reasons beyond Brennan's personal eccentricity for keeping it secret. Morning arrived with a determination that had been building through the sleepless night. Sarah needed information, and information required experts. She could not afford to hire appraisers, but she could seek free consultations, preliminary opinions that would at least establish whether she was holding treasure or trash. She left Maya with specific instructions, rules about staying in their safe area, not exploring alone, not touching the vault door. The child nodded with the solemnity she brought to all instructions now, her trust in her mother's judgment unshaken despite circumstances that would test an adult's faith. Sarah walked to the library, a journey that took 40 minutes through neighborhoods that grew progressively nicer as she moved away from the industrial zone. She felt conscious of her appearance, the clothes she had been wearing for days without proper washing facilities, the exhaustion that showed in her face no matter how much she tried to project competence. But shame was a luxury she had abandoned, along with so many others. She had work to do, and vanity could not be permitted to interfere. At the library, she spent hours researching, using the free internet access to educate herself in matters she should have understood before opening the vault. She learned about arts and crafts furniture, about the movement's history, about the makers whose stamps she had seen on pieces in the crates. She read about auction results, about record sales, about museums building collections around furniture that had once been considered merely functional. The numbers she encountered were staggering. Individual pieces selling for tens of thousands, rare examples commanding hundreds of thousands. She found articles about Marcus Brennan that she had missed in earlier research, pieces published in trade journals and collector magazines. He had been known in certain circles, not as a manufacturer, but as a collector, someone who had assembled significant holdings during decades when such furniture could still be acquired relatively affordably. Several articles mentioned his collection in passing, noting its quality and scope, but none revealed where he kept it or what had happened to it after his death. The assumption, reading between the lines, was that it had been sold off to cover his business's debts, scattered to the winds during the bankruptcy. But it had not been sold. It had been hidden, sealed, behind a vault door in a building everyone assumed held nothing but manufacturing equipment and failure. Brennan had protected his collection not by taking it with him, but by making it invisible, trusting that someday someone would find it and recognize its value. Or perhaps he had simply refused to surrender the one thing his creditors could not claim, choosing burial over confiscation. His motivations had died with him, but his collection survived, waiting in darkness for accidental discovery. Sarah began making calls, using the library's phone after carefully rehearsing what she would say. She contacted auction houses, explaining in vague terms that she had acquired property containing furniture that might be valuable, asking what steps would be required for authentication and sale. The responses varied from polite interest to dismissive skepticism. Everyone wanted to know specifics. What makers? What condition? What provenance? She provided what information she could without revealing too much, aware that desperation was visible even over phone lines, that people could sense when someone was operating from need rather than choice. One conversation led to a name, an appraiser who specialized in arts and crafts furniture, someone with expertise and a reputation for fair dealing. His office was in a city 2 hours away, but he sometimes traveled for significant collections. Sarah left a message, describing what she had found in terms that she hoped would convey value without sounding delusional. She did not mention the factory, the vault, the circumstances of her discovery. She presented herself as someone who had inherited property with unexpected contents, asking for preliminary assessment. The performance felt dishonest, but honesty was another luxury she had surrendered to necessity. The appraiser returned her call the following day, reaching her at the library where she had been waiting, hoping. His voice was measured, professional, neither encouraging nor dismissive. He asked detailed questions about maker's marks, about condition, about whether she had documentation. Sarah answered carefully, reading from notes she had made, describing what she had photographed before her phone died. There was a pause after she mentioned stickly pieces with original labels, a silence that felt weighted with significance. He asked if she was certain about the labels, if the pieces were complete, if the climate where they had been stored was controlled. She confirmed everything, her confidence growing as his questions became more specific, more urgent. He said he would need to see the collection in person before providing formal appraisal, but based on what she described, if authentic, the value could be substantial. He used the word substantial, the way doctors used serious when discussing conditions that were actually critical, a professional understatement that conveyed more through restraint than emphasis. He could visit in 3 days, if she could guarantee access to the collection, privacy for examination, and security for items that might need to be transported for further authentication. Sarah agreed to everything, providing the factory's address, specifying a time, hanging up with hands that trembled from relief and renewed anxiety. 3 days. In 3 days, she would know whether the vault held salvation or disappointment, whether Marcus Brennan's hidden collection would transform her life or become just another promise that dissolved under scrutiny. She walked back to the factory in gathering darkness, her thoughts cycling between hope and caution, unable to settle in either camp for long. When she arrived, she found Maya where she had left her, drawing pictures by the light of a battery-powered lantern, her materials spread across a cardboard box they used as a table. The child looked up as Sarah entered, her face brightening in a way that made Sarah's chest tighten with guilt and love. Maya asked if she had found help, if someone was coming to see the special furniture. Sarah confirmed that, yes, someone was coming, that they would know more soon, that things might get better. She tried to keep the uncertainty out of her voice, tried to project confidence her daughter deserved to receive from her mother. The 3 days passed with agonizing slowness. Sarah cleaned the vault, sweeping away dust that had settled despite the sealed environment, arranging crates so the appraiser could access them easily, organizing documentation in piles that she hoped demonstrated care rather than desperation. She rehearsed conversations, imagining questions and preparing answers that were truthful but managed the narrative carefully. She was not a squatter. She was the property owner. She had not stolen the furniture. She had discovered it during renovation. Each statement was technically accurate, but the framing mattered, and she worked to frame herself as someone worthy of belief. On the morning of the appointment, Sarah woke before dawn, unable to sleep. Anxiety and anticipation wound too tightly to permit rest. She did what she could to make the factory look less desperate, moving debris, hanging sheets to hide the worst damage, creating pathways that guided attention away from evidence of their living conditions. She wanted the appraiser to focus on the furniture, not on the circumstances of the person who had found it. Judgment would affect nothing about the collection's value, but it might affect his willingness to help her navigate the sales process, and she needed all the help she could get. The appraiser arrived precisely on time, driving a van that looked professional but not ostentatious, parking in the broken lot with the caution of someone accustomed to navigating questionable neighborhoods. He emerged carrying a case of tools and equipment, his appearance matching his voice, measured and professional, neither friendly nor cold. He introduced himself as Martin Wheeler, extending a hand that Sarah shook, conscious of her own rough palms against his smooth ones. He did not comment on the factory's condition, did not ask questions about her circumstances, simply requested to see the collection. Sarah led him to the vault, unlocking the steel door, watching his expression as the space revealed itself. He said nothing initially, but she saw his posture shift, saw professional skepticism give way to something more engaged. He asked permission to examine pieces, and when she granted it, he began moving through the crates with an efficiency that spoke of decades of experience. He photographed maker's marks, examined joints, tested finishes, referred to notes on his tablet, his face revealing nothing of his conclusions. The examination took hours. Maya stayed in their living area as instructed, occupying herself quietly, understanding somehow that this was important, that silence was required. Sarah watched Wheeler work, resisting the urge to ask questions, to press for preliminary opinions, knowing that patience was required even when every nerve screamed for immediate answers. He opened crates she had not accessed, discovering pieces she had not seen, his movements becoming quicker, more purposeful, as though the scope of what he was finding exceeded his expectations. When he finally straightened, setting down the magnifying glass he had been using to examine details, his expression was carefully controlled. but Sarah sensed something beneath the professional mask. He asked if she had any idea of the collection's value, if previous appraisals had been conducted, if she understood what she possessed. She admitted ignorance, saying only that she knew the furniture was old and appeared well made, that she hoped it might be worth something. The understatement felt absurd given what she had learned in her research, but she maintained the pretense, unwilling to show her hand. Wheeler was silent for a moment, and when he spoke, his voice carried a weight that made her heartbeat accelerate. He said that what she had here was one of the most significant private collections of arts and crafts furniture he had encountered in his career. He estimated, based on preliminary examination, that the collection's auction value could exceed $400 million. The number hung in the air between them, impossible to process, too large to mean anything immediate. Sarah asked him to repeat it, certain she had misheard. 400 million. He said it again, slower, watching her face for reaction. The world tilted, sound distorting, vision narrowing. Sarah felt her legs weaken, felt herself reaching for the wall to steady herself, felt Wheeler move toward her with concern that was probably professional, but felt personal. He was speaking, asking if she was all right, if she needed to sit, but the words reached her as though through water, muffled and distant. $400 million. She had bought a building for $950, had been mocked for the decision, had been told she was throwing away money on a structure fit only for demolition. And beneath it, hidden behind a steel door, Marcus Brennan had left a collection worth more than she could conceive. The vault continued to hold its secrets, its orderly rows of crates containing fortune that had been waiting, patient and silent, for someone desperate enough to look. Sarah sat on a crate in the vault, her hands pressed flat against her thighs to stop them from shaking. Martin Wheeler had stepped outside to make phone calls, to contact auction houses and specialists whose expertise would be required to handle a collection of this magnitude. Through the open vault door, she could hear his voice, professional and animated in ways it had not been during the examination, speaking in terms that meant nothing to her yet but would soon define her future. Authentication protocols, insurance requirements, consignment agreements, the language of a world she had never imagined entering. Maya appeared in the doorway, her small figure backlit by the factory's dim interior light. She asked if everything was okay, if the man had said good things about the furniture. Sarah tried to find words that would explain what $400 million meant to a 7-year-old who had learned to measure wealth in whether they could afford school lunch. She settled for pulling Maya close, holding her daughter against her chest, and saying simply that, yes, everything was going to be okay, that the furniture was valuable, that their lives were about to change in ways she could not yet describe. The child accepted this with the trust she brought to all her mother's promises, returning to her drawings with instructions to stay quiet while the adults talked. Sarah remained in the vault, surrounded by wooden crates that contained more money than she had ever conceived of possessing, and felt a terror she had not expected. The discovery should have been pure relief, pure joy, the answer to every prayer she had not allowed herself to speak. Instead, she felt as though she had been handed something too large to hold, too fragile to trust, too complex to navigate without making catastrophic mistakes. Wheeler returned, his expression more animated than before, explaining what would need to happen next. The collection would require comprehensive authentication, a process involving multiple experts, laboratories that could verify age and provenance through scientific analysis, documentation that would satisfy the most rigorous buyers. Pieces would need to be photographed professionally, catalogued in databases that tracked significant furniture, cross-referenced against historical records to establish ownership histories that could withstand legal scrutiny. The process would take months, possibly longer, but it was necessary to realize the collection's full value. He spoke about auction houses, about Sotheby's and Christie's, institutions Sarah knew only from news coverage of record-breaking sales. He mentioned private sales, collectors who might purchase the entire collection rather than seeing it dispersed piece by piece. He discussed insurance requirements that would protect the collection during authentication, security measures that would need to be implemented immediately to prevent theft or damage. Each detail added weight to her understanding of how far beyond her depth she had suddenly found herself. The question of ownership arose carefully. Wheeler asked about the property's chain of title, about whether there were any claims against the building or its contents, about whether previous owners might have legal grounds to contest her acquisition of what had been hidden inside. Sarah produced the deed, her hands still unsteady, showing documentation that the property and all structures and contents had transferred to her for the payment of back taxes. Wheeler examined the paperwork with the same careful attention he had brought to the furniture, then nodded with what appeared to be relief. The sale had been absolute, the building and everything in it now hers legally and completely. Still, he recommended she retain legal counsel, specialists in art and antiques law who could ensure the authentication and sale process protected her interests. The recommendation carried an implication she understood immediately. People would emerge, claiming connections to Marcus Brennan, to the factory, to the collection. Previous owners who had possessed the building without knowing what it contained would wonder if they had grounds for compensation. Creditors from Brennan's bankruptcy might argue that the collection should have been disclosed and used to satisfy debts. The legal landscape ahead was complicated, and navigating it would require expertise she could not afford, but would somehow need to acquire. Wheeler offered to help, not out of charity, but because his reputation would be enhanced by association with a discovery of this significance. He would connect her with attorneys who specialized in estate and collection sales, with insurance brokers who understood high-value assets, with security consultants who could protect the collection until it could be properly secured. In exchange, he would serve as the primary appraiser, his fees contingent on successful authentication and sale. The arrangement was business, not generosity, but Sarah accepted gratefully, understanding that she needed every ally she could find. Before leaving, Wheeler made arrangements for immediate security. He knew people, he said, professionals who could be on site within hours, who would ensure the vault remained sealed and protected until more permanent measures were implemented. The cost would be significant, but it would be billed against the eventual sale proceeds, allowing Sarah to secure what she had found without depleting resources she did not possess. He spoke about these arrangements as though they were routine, as though everyone eventually discovered $400 million in hidden furniture and needed armed guards to protect it. After he left, Sarah locked the vault and stood in the empty factory, feeling the space differently now. What had been a ruin was suddenly a repository. What had been her biggest mistake was transforming into her salvation. The irony was almost painful. Everyone who had warned her, who had mocked her decision, who had questioned her judgment, had been operating with incomplete information. The building had contained value they could not see, fortune hidden so completely that only accident and desperation had revealed it. She had been right for the wrong reasons, successful because she had no other options, vindicated by blind luck more than wisdom. The security team arrived as Wheeler had promised, 3 men in unmarked vehicle who surveyed the property with professional efficiency. They installed motion sensors, cameras that fed to monitoring systems they would watch remotely, reinforced locks on doors that had barely functioned. The lead man explained that they would maintain constant surveillance until permanent security could be established, that any unauthorized entry would trigger immediate response. The transformation of her derelict factory into a secured facility happened in hours, changing the nature of her occupancy from squatting to guarding. That night, sleeping in the same corner she and Maya had occupied for weeks, Sarah felt the building's character shift around her. The sounds were the same, the cold as penetrating, the discomfort as constant. Yet knowing what lay behind the steel door changed everything. She was no longer homeless, merely temporarily between proper accommodations. She was not destitute, simply waiting for assets to liquidate. The distinction was semantic, her immediate circumstances unchanged, but the future had been rewritten completely. Tomorrow would bring the same struggles, but those struggles now had an expiration date. Sleep came eventually, fitful but sufficient, her dreams cycling through scenarios that ranged from triumphant to catastrophic. She imagined walking into her sister's home with news that would reverse every judgment Jennifer had passed. She imagined Maya in new clothes, in a proper bed, in a school where lunch money was never questioned. She imagined herself signing papers that transferred wealth beyond imagination, then waking to find the vault empty, the furniture vanished, the whole discovery a delusion born of desperation. The dreams lacked narrative coherence, but their emotional content was clear. Hope and terror, intertwined so completely they became indistinguishable. The news began to spread, despite Sarah's attempts at discretion. Wheeler had contacts in the antiques world, and those contacts had contacts, and within days, the rumor network that connected dealers, collectors, and auction houses was humming with speculation. A major arts and crafts collection had been discovered, hidden for decades, authenticated by Wheeler, possibly the largest private holding of Stickley furniture ever found. The details were vague, locations and owners unnamed, but the antiques community was small enough that speculation would eventually narrow to truth. The first journalist arrived within a week, a reporter from a trade publication who had somehow tracked the story to Sarah's location. She declined to comment, following advice Wheeler had provided, but the reporter photographed the factory from the street, noted its location, published a piece that connected enough dots to make the identification obvious to anyone paying attention. The article described the building's history, Marcus Brennan's reputation as a collector, the mysterious disappearance of his holdings after his death. It stopped short of naming Sarah, but it provided enough information that anyone familiar with recent property sales could make the connection. Her phone, charged now through power provided by the security team's generator, began receiving calls. Reporters asking for interviews, dealers offering to broker private sales, attorneys proposing their services. The volume was overwhelming, each call representing someone who wanted something from her, who saw her sudden fortune as an opportunity to extract their own share. She stopped answering, letting messages accumulate, trusting that Wheeler and the attorneys he had connected her with would filter genuine necessity from opportunistic noise. The transformation became public in ways she had not anticipated. A local news station ran a story about the discovery, using exterior shots of the factory, describing Sarah in terms that were simultaneously sympathetic and sensational. Single mother, down on her luck, makes discovery of a lifetime. The narrative was simplified, her struggles compressed into sound bites, but the core facts were accurate enough. She had bought the building for almost nothing. She had found furniture worth hundreds of millions. She had gone from desperate to wealthy overnight, a story so perfectly calibrated for viral distribution that it spread through social media with predictable velocity. Her sister called, Jennifer's voice tight with emotions. Sarah could not fully pause. Shock, certainly, Relief. Probably. Perhaps some resentment that Sarah's reckless gamble had paid off in ways that made Jennifer's own careful life choices look timid by comparison. The conversation was awkward, both of them navigating territory without established etiquette. Jennifer apologized for doubting, though the apology felt obligatory rather than felt. She offered help that Sarah no longer needed, asked questions about the collection that Sarah could not yet answer. They ended the call with promises to speak again soon, both understanding that their relationship had shifted in ways that would take time to navigate. Her former supervisor called too, his tone artificially warm, asking how she was doing, whether she had considered returning to work. The absurdity of the question would have been funny if it had not been so transparently motivated. He wanted to position himself as someone who had supported her, who had understood her potential all along, rewriting his own role in her history to benefit from her changed circumstances. She told him politely that she would not be returning, that other opportunities had emerged, declining to elaborate despite his increasingly obvious attempts to extract details. The most difficult confrontation came from her former co-workers, several of whom showed up at the factory uninvited. They claimed they wanted to congratulate her, to celebrate her good fortune, but their presence felt intrusive, their questions probing rather than friendly. They asked to see the collection, suggested they had always known she was smart, reminded her of small kindnesses they had shown during her employment, as though those kindnesses now deserved acknowledgement in material form. Sarah recognized the dynamic, the way sudden wealth transformed relationships, making her a resource rather than a person. She kept the conversation brief, cordial but firm, escorting them out without providing the access or validation they sought. The authentication process began in earnest, involving a rotation of specialists who arrived with equipment and credentials that required careful verification. Each expert examined different aspects of the collection, their areas of focus overlapping to create comprehensive documentation. Wood specialists analyzed grain patterns and joinery techniques. Finish experts tested patinas and original surfaces. Historical researchers traced provenance through archives and estate records. The vault became a workspace, its careful organization disrupted by the systematic examination, each piece tagged and catalogued before being wrapped and transported to laboratories for analysis that could not be conducted on site. Sarah watched this process with anxiety that never fully receded. Each piece that left the vault felt like a risk, a treasure removed from her protection and placed in the hands of strangers who assured her they understood its value but whom she had no ability to truly verify. Wheeler remained her primary contact, translating technical findings into language she could understand, explaining when delays occurred, why certain tests required months rather than weeks, how authentication standards had evolved to prevent the kind of fraud that had once plagued high-value antiques markets. The collection's documentation grew into multiple volumes, binders filled with certificates and analyses that established each piece's authenticity with exhaustive detail. Radiocarbon dating confirmed wood ages, consistent with claimed manufacturing periods. Chemical analysis of finishes matched historical formulations. Makers' marks were photographed under magnification and compared against databases of authenticated examples. Provenance chains were reconstructed through bills of sale, exhibition records, photographs that showed pieces in documented settings. The cumulative weight of evidence transformed speculation into certainty, establishing beyond reasonable doubt that Marcus Brennan's collection was exactly what it appeared to be. As authentication progressed, valuations became more precise. The initial 400 million estimate proved conservative. Several pieces were rarer than Wheeler had initially assessed, their value amplified by condition that exceeded even optimistic projections. A complete dining set by Gustav Stickley, with original finish and complete provenance, was projected to sell for 30 million alone. A library table by Charles Limbert, one of only 3 known examples, carried an estimate of 15 million. Cabinet after cabinet revealed pieces that individually commanded 7 figures, collectively representing wealth that made even experienced appraisers recalibrate their assumptions. The decision of how to sell the collection became its own complicated negotiation. Auction houses competed for consignment, presenting proposals that outlined marketing strategies, global promotion, collector outreach that would maximize bidding competition. Each house emphasized its strengths, its record-breaking sales, its relationships with major collectors who would travel internationally for the opportunity to acquire pieces of this significance. The presentations were sophisticated, their proposed commissions substantial but justified by the expertise they would bring to sales that could not be handled casually. Private sale options emerged as well. Collectors and institutions that wanted to acquire the collection intact rather than seeing it dispersed. Museums expressed interest in pieces that would fill gaps in their arts and crafts holdings. Private collectors proposed purchases that would keep assemblages together, preserving Brennan's curatorial vision rather than fragmenting it through auction. These offers were often higher in total value than projected auction proceeds, trading the excitement of competitive bidding for the certainty of negotiated sales. Sarah listened to all proposals, understanding that each choice carried implications beyond simple monetary calculation, but ultimately deferring to Wheeler and the attorneys who understood these markets in ways she could not hope to master through crash education. The decision was made to pursue a hybrid approach, selling the most significant pieces through prestigious auction events that would generate media attention and establish value benchmarks, while placing other pieces through private sales to collectors and institutions whose interest had been carefully vetted. The strategy balanced risk and reward, public spectacle and discreet transaction, ensuring that the collection's full value would be realized while respecting the different markets that existed for different types of pieces. The first major auction was scheduled for spring, giving the auction house time to market the event internationally, to produce catalog entries that would become reference documents for scholars, to coordinate with media outlets that would cover what was being described as the most significant arts and crafts furniture sale in decades. Sarah was asked to participate in promotional materials, to tell her story in ways that would add human interest to technical descriptions of furniture. She agreed reluctantly, understanding that narrative mattered in these sales, that buyers were purchasing not just objects, but stories, provenance that included the drama of discovery alongside the history of creation. The interviews were difficult, requiring her to present herself as someone who had maintained composure and wisdom throughout circumstances that had actually reduced her to desperation. The journalists wanted to hear about her vision, her courage, her determination to succeed against odds that would have defeated others. The reality that she had been terrified and hopeless, that discovery had been accidental rather than strategic, did not fit the narrative they were constructing. She learned to provide quotes that were true enough without being complete, to allow herself to be shaped into a character that served the collection's promotion. As spring approached and the auction date solidified, Sarah and Maya moved out of the factory and into temporary housing that felt almost surreal in its normalcy. An apartment in a better neighborhood than she had ever lived in, paid for through advances against the auction proceeds, furnished with pieces that were new rather than scavenged. Maya had her own room, decorated in colors she had chosen herself, filled with toys that were purchased without calculating what would have to be sacrificed to afford them. They ate meals at a table, slept in beds, used bathrooms that worked reliably. The transition should have been relief, but Sarah felt disoriented, as though she had been dropped into someone else's life and was merely occupying it until the rightful owner returned. Maya adjusted more easily, her resilience manifesting as rapid adaptation to circumstances that no longer required constant vigilance. She returned to school, entering a grade ahead of where she had left off, her teachers noting with approval that the disruption had not impaired her academic progress. Sarah watched her daughter make friends, bring home artwork that depicted houses with straight walls and closed doors, speak about futures that extended beyond the next meal. The transformation was everything Sarah had wanted, yet it carried an undercurrent of loss she had not anticipated. Their time in the factory, as terrible as it had been theirs alone, a shared struggle that had bonded them in ways that comfort might dilute. The auction approached with mounting intensity. Media coverage increased, feature articles in newspapers and magazines that profiled Sarah, that showed photographs of selected pieces from the collection, that built anticipation among collectors who were already planning their bidding strategies. Wheeler kept Sarah informed of interest levels, of pre-auction viewings that attracted hundreds of serious collectors, of telephone bidding registrations from international buyers who would participate remotely. The auction house estimated that total proceeds could exceed $500 million once buyers' premiums and additional sales were calculated. The number had lost its ability to shock her through repetition, but it retained enough unreality that she could not fully integrate it into her understanding of her own life. The auction itself was held in New York, in a venue that had hosted similar sales for generations, its architecture designed to confer gravitas on commercial transactions. Sarah attended, sitting in a section reserved for consigners, watching as collectors filed in and took their seats with the focused attention of people preparing for battle. The room filled slowly, conversations conducted in hushed tones that suggested respect for the significance of what was about to occur. Telephones were staffed by auction house employees who would relay bids from remote participants, their connections verified through protocols that prevented fraud. The sale began with smaller pieces, establishing rhythm and tone, giving bidders time to adjust to the pace before major lots arrived. Sarah watched numbers escalate with a detachment that felt almost clinical, as though observing something that had no connection to her own life. A chair she had unwrapped from cloth in the vault sold for $180,000. A table went for $300,000. Each sale was accompanied by information from the auctioneer, provenance details that connected pieces to their makers, to their histories, to Marcus Brennan's decades of careful acquisition. When the major pieces came up, the energy in the room changed. Bidding accelerated, puddles rising with increasing frequency as collectors competed for items that might never appear on the market again. The Stickley dining set that had been estimated at $30 million opened at $20 and climbed rapidly, bidders pushing past the estimate, past reasonable projections, finally hammering down at $43 million to applause that broke the room's formal restraint. The Limbert table exceeded its estimate even more dramatically, selling for $22 million to a telephone bidder whose identity would remain private. Piece after piece brought prices that rewrote record books, that would be cited in future sales as new benchmarks for what collectors would pay for authenticated examples from the arts and crafts movement's most significant makers. By the time the final piece sold, hours after the sale had begun, total proceeds exceeded $600 million. The auction house staff congratulated Sarah with enthusiasm that was professional but genuine, their own commissions substantial enough to make them personally invested in the collection's success. Wheeler embraced her briefly, his normally reserved demeanor cracking to reveal satisfaction that went beyond financial interest. This was the culmination of his career, the sale that would define his reputation, and he had navigated it with expertise that had maximized value while maintaining the integrity required to preserve trust with both sellers and buyers. The aftermath of the auction was almost as complex as its preparation. Funds had to be transferred, verified, distributed according to agreements that involved the auction house, the attorneys, Wheeler, the insurance brokers, the security team, and numerous other parties whose services had been essential to realizing the collection's value. The calculations took weeks, money moving through accounts in ways Sarah did not fully track, trusting that the financial advisors she had retained were protecting her interests. When the final distributions settled, her personal proceeds exceeded $415 million. After all, fees and commissions had been deducted. The number appeared in her bank account, not as a single dramatic deposit, but as a series of transfers that accumulated over days, each one representing sales of different pieces, each verified and documented through processes designed to prevent the kind of fraud that could occur when such large amounts moved between parties. Sarah checked her balance repeatedly, unable to fully believe that the numbers displayed were real, that she had gone from negative net worth to wealth that exceeded the GDP of small nations. The transformation was complete, but it had happened so quickly that her understanding lagged behind the reality, leaving her feeling simultaneously grateful and unmoored. Life after the auction became an education in managing wealth, in understanding that money at this scale required professional management Sarah could not provide herself. She worked with advisors who established trusts, who invested in diversified portfolios designed to preserve capital while generating income, who structured her finances in ways that minimized tax liability while ensuring she could access funds when needed. She established a foundation, directing a portion of her wealth toward causes that reflected her experience, supporting single mothers, funding housing initiatives, endowing scholarships for children whose academic progress had been disrupted by instability. She purchased property, not as investment, but as statement. The factory, which she still owned, was renovated completely, transformed from ruin into a mixed-use space that combined her private residence with studios for artists and craftspeople who could not afford commercial rent. The project was expensive, far more costly than the building's value justified, but Sarah funded it without hesitation, wanting to preserve the place where her life had turned, where desperation had accidentally become discovery. The renovation revealed additional secrets, smaller caches of documents and tools that Brennan had hidden throughout the structure, each finding adding depth to the understanding of a man who had protected his collection with elaborate care. Sarah established relationships with museums, donating pieces from the collection's remainder to institutions that could display them publicly, ensuring that Brennan's passion would be preserved in ways that honored his intent, even as it transformed his private obsession into public heritage. The donations were substantial enough to warrant naming recognition, galleries, and wings that would carry acknowledgement of her contribution. But she declined most of these honors, preferring that the focus remain on the furniture itself rather than on her accidental role in preserving it. Maya thrived in ways that Sarah had hoped for, but not dared to expect. The child who had learned to be small, to want less, to apologize for need, gradually relaxed into security that allowed larger aspirations. She spoke of college, of careers, of futures that extended decades rather than days. Sarah encouraged everything, funding educational opportunities that ranged from tutors to travel, determined that her daughter would never again feel limited by circumstances beyond her control. The transformation was not immediate. Years of scarcity, leaving marks that comfort could soften, but not completely erase. Yet, the trajectory was clear. Maya was becoming someone who expected rather than hoped, someone who planned rather than survived. Jennifer visited. The sisters, navigating their changed relationship with care that felt both necessary and sad. Jennifer's life remained stable, comfortable, successful by conventional measures, but the disparity in wealth created awkwardness that had not existed before. Sarah tried to bridge this, offering help that Jennifer sometimes accepted and sometimes declined. Both of them aware that money changed dynamics in ways that good intentions could not fully neutralize. They found their way to something that resembled their former closeness, though it was different now, marked by Sarah's restraint and Jennifer's pride. By silences that had not existed before, fortune had rewritten one sister's circumstances while leaving the others unchanged. The people who had mocked Sarah's decision to buy the factory responded in varied ways. Her former supervisor sent a letter, rambling and self-serving, suggesting he had always seen her potential, asking if she might consider investing in a business opportunity he was developing. She declined without explanation, understanding that his assessment of her potential had been revised retroactively to serve his current needs. Co-workers reached out through social media, their messages ranging from genuine congratulation to barely disguised requests for financial assistance. She responded to some and ignored others, developing the instinct that came with wealth to distinguish between authentic relationship and opportunistic contact. The media attention eventually faded, new stories displacing hers in the cycle that governed public attention. She welcomed the return to relative privacy, the ability to move through her days without being recognized, without her circumstances being public knowledge. The factory renovation completed. She moved into the top floor, creating space that was comfortable without being ostentatious, that maintained connection to the building's industrial history while providing the security and amenity that wealth could purchase. She liked being able to see the floor where the vault had been, the space that had contained fortune for decades before revealing itself to someone desperate enough to look. Years passed, each one bringing adjustments to her understanding of what her wealth meant and what it could accomplish. She learned that money solved problems she had once considered insurmountable, that scarcity could be eliminated through application of sufficient resources. But she also learned that wealth created different problems, that managing it required constant attention, that the responsibility of stewardship was heavier than the burden of poverty had been. She missed, occasionally, the simplicity of having nothing, the clarity that came when choices were limited by necessity rather than expanded by possibility. Maya graduated high school, then college, pursuing education that had once seemed like fantasy but had become expected trajectory. She studied art history, drawn to the field perhaps by early exposure to the furniture that had transformed their lives, perhaps by genuine interest that would have emerged regardless. She spoke of Marcus Brennan with respect, of the man who had assembled a collection without knowing it would eventually save a single mother and her daughter decades after his death. Sarah listened to these reflections and felt gratitude toward someone she had never met, whose careful hiding of treasure had been discovered at exactly the moment when discovery mattered most. The factory became a landmark of sorts, known locally as the place where the famous furniture discovery had occurred, marked by historical designation that protected it from demolition or unsympathetic alteration. Visitors occasionally appeared, asking if they could see where the vault had been, whether any furniture remained. Sarah accommodated some of these requests, understanding that her story had become public property, that her privacy had been exchanged for fortune, whether she preferred this trade or not. She spoke to journalists who wanted to write retrospectives, to documentary filmmakers who wanted to chronicle the discovery. She told her story again and again, until it took on the quality of myth, a narrative that had been smoothed and shaped by repetition into something more coherent than the lived reality had been. She thought often of that morning when she had signed the deed, when $950 had felt like more money than she could afford to lose, when the decision to buy a condemned building had been labeled as crazy by everyone who claimed to care about her welfare. The judgment had been reasonable, based on information available at the time, yet it had been completely wrong. The building had contained salvation, and only her desperation had been severe enough to override the rational caution that would have prevented discovery. She had been saved by having no better options, vindicated by circumstances she could not have predicted, transformed by accident that masqueraded as fate. Late at night, when the factory was quiet and Maya was asleep in her apartment across the city, Sarah sometimes walked through the renovated space, her footsteps echoing on polished floors that bore no resemblance to the debris-covered concrete she had first encountered. She visited the area where the vault had been, now converted into a gallery where rotating exhibits displayed furniture from local craftspeople, carrying forward something of Brennan's commitment to preservation and craft. The steel door was gone, removed during renovation, but Sarah remembered its weight, the resistance of its lock, the moment when it had opened to reveal darkness that held light. She thought about luck, about the role that chance had played in her survival, about how differently her story could have ended if Maya had found the key a week later, if Wheeler had been unavailable, if the auction market had been softer. The margin between success and catastrophe had been thin enough to measure in moments, in choices that had felt insignificant when made but proved decisive in retrospect. She could not claim credit for wisdom she had not possessed, could not pretend that desperation was the same as vision. She had gambled because she had nothing left to lose, and the gamble had paid off in ways that transcended any rational expectation. The transformation of her life remained impossible to fully integrate, even years after the auction that had converted furniture into liquid wealth. She was wealthy beyond measure, secure beyond threat, but the years of poverty had left marks that comfort could not erase. She found herself calculating prices at grocery stores, noticing sale signs, feeling phantom anxiety when spending money, even though her accounts would never approach empty. Maya laughed at these habits, gently teasing her mother for behaviors that no longer matched their circumstances. But Sarah could not fully abandon reflexes that had kept them alive when resources had been counted in dollars rather than millions. She established routines that maintained connection to her former life, volunteering at shelters that served populations she had once been part of, funding but also participating in programs that helped single mothers navigate systems designed to frustrate rather than assist. She met women who reminded her of who she had been, who were making impossible decisions with insufficient resources, who were being told their struggles reflected personal failure rather than structural inadequacy. She helped where she could, funding apartments, paying off debts, providing the kind of intervention that had not existed for her but could exist for others now that she possessed means to create it. The question of Marcus Brennan's motives remained unanswered, would always remain unanswered, buried with the man who had built the collection and then hidden it so completely that it survived decades of turnover and neglect. Sarah commissioned research into his life, hiring historians to assemble biography that might explain why someone would amass fortune and then seal it behind steel rather than converting it to liquidity that could have saved his failing business. The findings were incomplete, suggestive rather than definitive, painting Brennan as a complicated figure whose love of craft exceeded his business acumen, whose collection represented something more valuable to him than money could measure. Perhaps he had believed his business would recover, that the collection would remain hidden until circumstances improved enough to retrieve it. Perhaps he had wanted to protect it from creditors, refusing to surrender beauty to satisfy debts. Perhaps he had simply been eccentric, driven by impulses that made sense to him but could not be explained to others. Whatever his reasoning, his decision to hide rather than sell had created the conditions for Sarah's discovery, had preserved fortune that would have been scattered and lost if subjected to bankruptcy proceedings. His irrational attachment to furniture had become her rational salvation. His failure to monetize had enabled her transformation. The irony was not lost on Sarah, the understanding that his mistake had been her deliverance. She created a permanent exhibit in the factory, dedicating space to documenting Brennan's life, his collection methodology, the history of the pieces that had passed through his hands over decades of acquisition. She displayed some of the smaller items she had retained, pieces too meaningful to sell, furniture that would remain as physical connection to the man whose hidden vault had changed her life. Visitors moved through these spaces with interest that validated her sense that the story mattered, that preservation of this history honored something beyond personal fortune. The factory itself became symbol of transformation, proof that ruins could contain resurrection, that judgment made from outside could not account for possibilities hidden from view. Sarah received letters from people who had read about her story, who had been inspired to take risks they had been avoiding, who had found courage in her example, even though she insisted she had not been courageous, merely desperate. She tried to respond honestly, to explain that desperation was not a strategy she would recommend, that survival often depended on luck as much as effort. But she understood that people needed stories of transformation, that her accidental fortune served psychological needs that had nothing to do with the historical facts of its acquisition. Maya grew into adulthood with the security Sarah had always wanted for her, but also with an understanding of vulnerability that came from experience rather than imagination. She spoke of their time in the factory not with shame but with recognition that it had shaped her, that the months of sleeping on concrete had taught her resilience that comfort alone could never provide. She thanked Sarah occasionally for the risks she had taken, for the decision to buy a building that everyone had insisted was worthless, for the determination to survive circumstances that would have broken others. Sarah accepted this gratitude with ambivalence, knowing that the line between success and disaster had been thinner than Maya understood, that praise felt unearned when outcome had depended so heavily on chance. Now, standing in the renovated factory, looking out windows that had been restored to their original clarity, Sarah thought about the woman she had been when she first walked through the steel door with a key she had almost discarded, when she had opened crates without knowing they contained fortune that would erase every struggle she had endured. That woman had been terrified and desperate, operating at the edge of her capacity, making choices because no alternatives remained. This woman, the one she had become, was secure and comfortable, making choices because possibilities were abundant rather than scarce. Both versions were real. Both had value. The transformation had not erased who she had been, merely added to it, building security onto foundation that remained marked by scarcity's lessons. She would never forget what it felt like to count dollars, to choose between necessities, to watch her daughter try to make herself smaller. Those memories were not burdens to be discarded, but context that gave meaning to everything that had followed. She had been saved by accident, but she would honor that salvation through intention, through using wealth to create for others the opportunities that chance had created for her. The factory stood as monument to all of this, to struggle and discovery, to failure transformed into vindication, to judgment proven wrong by outcome that could not have been predicted. It housed artists who created without financial pressure, provided space for community programs, that served populations Sarah had once belonged to, demonstrated that property could serve purposes beyond profit. It was her answer to everyone who had called her crazy, proof that they had been wrong not because they had lacked information, but because they had assumed their information was complete. Sarah Chen had bought a demolished furniture factory for $950, the last money she could afford to spend, and discovered $415 million, hidden behind a steel door in a vault Marcus Brennan had sealed decades before she was born. The transformation had been complete, the vindication absolute, but what she valued most was simpler than fortune. She had given her daughter security. She had preserved something beautiful. She had proven that sometimes, when the world offered nothing but bad choices, picking the one that seemed most desperate could lead to salvation that rational caution would have prevented. It was not a lesson she would recommend to others, but it was the truth of how her life had been rewritten, one condemned building and one hidden vault at a time. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you loved this story, check out the other videos on your screen now. I think you'll really enjoy them. And don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. See you in the next story.